You probably only know how to carry trays. You'd misread the whole Italian menu. The mocking voices rang out, forcing Elena Rossi to lower her head under the weight of scornful stares. But moments later, when an Italian guest complained no one understood him, she spoke fluently and flawlessly, leaving the restaurant frozen. And at the next table, billionaire Adrian Moretti quietly slid her a slip of paper and a first-class ticket to Rome. Italy is waiting for you. In that instant, every person who had laughed at her went silent, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. Elena stood in the middle of the restaurant, her hands gripping the edges of her tray like it was the only thing keeping her steady. The place was a palace of wealth. White tablecloths, so crisp they looked ironed mid-dinner, crystal glasses catching the golden glow of chandeliers, the air thick with the scent of truffle oil and expensive cologne. She was 27, her black hair loose and unstyled, her face bare, her uniform a faded gray that hung a little too loose on her frame. She didn't belong here, or so everyone thought. Her beauty was quiet, the kind you'd miss if you were looking for flash, and people did miss it. They saw the plain clothes, the lack of makeup, and they judged. They always judged. But Elena wasn't raised to care about their stares. Her parents, Italian immigrants who'd built an empire from nothing, taught her to carry herself with discipline, to let her actions speak, to never beg for respect. Tonight, though, that lesson felt heavier than ever, like a stone in her chest, as the room watched her every move. Hey, before we dive deeper, if this moment hits you, if you've ever felt like Elena standing in a place where people look right through you, grab your phone real quick. Hit that like button, drop a comment below about what this feels like for you, and subscribe to the channel. It's just a small way to stay connected, to walk through these stories together. All right, let's keep going. The night had started quietly enough. The restaurant, nestled in a 5-star hotel in New York, was buzzing with the usual crowdmen in suits that cost more than Elena's rent. Women with handbags that screamed status, their laughter sharp and practiced. Elena moved through it all, her steps quick but careful, balancing plates of pasta and glasses of wine with a precision that came from years of practice. She didn't chat with the guests, didn't flash big smiles like the other waitresses. That wasn't her way. She was there to work, to make sure every plate landed perfectly, every glass was filled before it was empty. But then came the Italian guest, a man in his 50s with a sharp jaw and eyes that carried a quiet weariness. He sat alone at a corner table, his voice low as he started ordering in Italian, each word crisp and deliberate. The other waitstaff froze. One of them, a lanky guy named Derek, with a smirk that seemed glued to his face, muttered, "Great, another foreigner making our night harder," and turned away. The guest's hands tightened on the tablecloth, his jaw twitching. Elena didn't think twice. She stepped forward of her tray still in hand and answered in Italian. Her voice was soft like a breeze, but every word was perfect, flowing like she'd grown up in a Tuscan village. She suggested a risotto with wild mushrooms, described the specials, with a warmth that made the guest lean forward, of his face softening. "Perfetto," he said, his voice loud enough to carry. The table next to him, a group of women in their 20s with glittering dresses and sharp manicures, stopped talking to stare. Derek, leaning against the bar, let out a laugh that cut through the room. "Oh, look at her," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. Trying to show off with her fake Italian, the other waitresses joined in their giggles like needles. Kristen, a tall blonde with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, leaned toward another server and whispered, "Bet that guy doesn't even get her accent. Sounds like she's choking on it." Elena's cheeks flushed a quick heat she tried to hide by turning toward the kitchen. But she kept her smile, kept moving, kept doing her job. The Italian guest didn't let it slide. He froze his fork halfway to his mouth, and then his face broke into a wide grin. "You sound like a native," he said in Italian, his voice carrying across the room. "I thought I was back in Rome." He stood up, reached for Elena's hand, and shook it firmly, his eyes bright with something like pride. "Brava," he said louder, now turning to the room. Brava?" The diners nearby turned their forks, pausing, their whispers starting. A few clapped, the sound soft but real, like a small wave breaking. Elena bowed her head just a little, her eyes glistening with something she wouldn't let fall. "Grazie," she murmured, her voice steady as she stepped back, smoothing her apron with one hand. Kristen, still at the bar, rolled her eyes so hard it was almost audible, whatever she muttered to Derek, who snorted. Their laughter was quieter now, but it still landed like a slap. As Elena moved to clear another table, a woman in a sleek black dress, her hair pulled into a tight bun, beckoned her over with a single finger. The woman's voice was syrupy, her smile too wide like she was performing for the table. "Honey, you're doing great with that little Italian act," she said, her words dripping with condescension. "But maybe stick to carrying plates. It's safer." Her friends chuckled, their eyes scanning Elena's stained apron like it was evidence of her failure. Elena paused, her hand hovering over a glass she was about to clear. She looked at the woman, her gaze steady, and said, "I'll keep that in mind." Her voice was calm, but there was a weight to it, a quiet edge that made the woman's smile falter. The table went quiet, the chuckles dying out. Elena turned away, her movements precise, but her fingers curled tightly around the edge of her tray, the knuckles whitening for just a moment before she relaxed them. Across the room, a group of young VIPs, 3 men and 2 women, all in their early 30s, dressed like they owned the city, watched the whole thing with smirks. One of them, a guy with slicked back hair and a Rolex that flashed like a warning, leaned forward. "Hey waitress," he called, his voice thick with mockery as he butchered the name of a pasta dish, dragging out the vowels like a bad caricature. "That right?" His friends laughed, their glasses clinking as they leaned back in their chairs. Elena walked over, her face calm, and corrected him gently, her Italian crisp and flawless. The guy's smirk grew wider. "Oh, listen to her," he said, turning to his friends. "Think she's some kind of language professor." Without warning, he tipped his wine glass, letting a stream of red splash across the table and onto Elena's apron. The stain bloomed dark and ugly, soaking into the fabric. "See?" he said, his voice loud with fake innocence. "Now she really looks Italian." His friends roared, one of the women slapping the table as she laughed, her bracelet jangling. Elena's hands froze on her tray. Her lips parted just for a moment, and her breath hitched. She bit her lip hard and pulled a cloth from her pocket, wiping at the stain with quick, steady strokes. "I'll get you a new glass," she said, her voice low but polite, like the wine hadn't just ruined her uniform. The group kept laughing, their voices echoing off the walls, but Elena didn't look at them. She turned toward the kitchen, her steps even, her back straight. At a nearby table, an older couple exchanged a glance, the woman's hand tightening on her napkin. A man in a corner booth pulled out his phone, the faint click of a camera cutting through the noise. Elena's hands shook as she pushed through the kitchen doors, the cloth still clutched in her fist. Inside the kitchen, she leaned against the counter for a moment, her breath uneven. The cooks were too busy to notice, their voices loud over the hiss of pans and the clatter of knives. She looked down at her apron, the red stain spreading like a wound. She folded the cloth, tucked it into her pocket, and grabbed a fresh apron from the rack. Her fingers moved fast, tying the strings, smoothing the fabric. She caught her reflection in a polished steel fridge, her face pale, her eyes too bright. She closed them for a second, just one, and then walked back out. The room was waiting, the air heavy with eyes. As Elena returned, a man at a nearby table, his tie loosened and his face flushed from too much wine, waved her over. He held up a menu, pointing at it like it was a prop in a comedy show. "Can you even read this?" he asked, his voice slurring slightly. "Or do you just pretend to know what's going on?" The table around him erupted in laughter, their glasses raised in a mock toast. Elena stood there, the menu in her hand, and read the dish names aloud in perfect Italian, her voice steady as stone. The man blinked, his grin slipping, but he recovered quickly. "Yeah, well, doesn't change the fact you're just a server," he said, tossing the menu onto the table. Elena's fingers tightened on the tray, but she nodded, her face unchanged, and walked away. The laughter followed her, but it was thinner now, less certain, like the room was starting to sense something shifting. As Elena crossed the room to refill a water pitcher, a woman in a velvet green gown, her earrings dangling like chandeliers, called out to her. "Excuse me, dear," she said, her voice loud and theatrical, "but you're standing in the way of our view." She gestured toward the window, where the city lights sparkled and smirked at her table mates. "Maybe you could move. It's a bit distracting having you here." The group tittered, their eyes raking over Elena's plain uniform. Elena stepped aside, her pitcher steady, and said, "Of course, ma'am." Her voice was polite, but her eyes lingered on the woman for a moment, sharp and unwavering. The woman's smirk wavered, her hand fidgeting with her napkin as Elena moved away. A man at the table muttered something about hired help, but the laughter was forced, and a few guests nearby shifted uncomfortably, their forks clinking against plates. At the next table, a man in a dark suit set down his glass with a soft clink. Adrian Moretti. Everyone knew his name, even if they pretended not to. He was in his 40s with salt and pepper hair, and eyes that seemed to see everything at once. Billionaire Italian heritage owner of Moretti Air, a private airline for people who thought private jets were too common. He'd been watching the whole scene, his face unreadable until now. He leaned forward, his voice cutting through the laughter like a knife. "You should be ashamed," he said in Italian, his words aimed at the VIPs. The group froze, their smiles fading like smoke. He turned to Elena, his expression softening. "Few in America speak Italian this perfectly anymore," he said, his voice warm but firm. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a sleek black business card, and slid it onto her tray. "For you," he said, his eyes meeting hers for a brief, steady moment. The room buzzed. Diners leaned toward each other, whispering. "That's Moretti," a woman said, her voice low with awe. "The airline guy." The VIPs shifted in their seats, one of them muttering something about just a card, but their laughter was gone. Elena looked down at the card, her fingers brushing the embossed gold letters. She didn't smile, didn't say anything. She just nodded, tucked the card into her pocket, and moved on to the next table. But Kristen, the blonde waitress, wasn't done. She stormed over her heels, clicking like a countdown, and snatched the card from Elena's pocket before she could react. "Probably a fake," Kristen said, holding it up to the light like she was checking for a watermark. "No billionaire's wasting his time on you." She tore the card in half, then in quarters, and tossed the pieces onto the floor. The other waitstaff laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that echoed in the quiet. "Oops," Kristen said, her smile all teeth. Elena froze. Her hands hovered over her tray, her eyes locked on the torn pieces scattered across the floor. The room seemed to hold its breath. A woman with pearls at a nearby table shook her head, her lips tight. Another guest, a man in a gray suit, pulled out his phone and started recording, his jaw set. Elena knelt down, her movements slow and careful, and picked up every piece of the card one by one. Her fingers trembled, but her face stayed calm, her eyes steady. She stood tucking the pieces into her pocket and went back to work. The laughter from the waitstaff faded, replaced by an uneasy quiet. The Italian guest at the corner table watched her, his eyes narrowed like he was seeing something the others missed. As Elena moved to another table, a young man in a tailored blazer, his hair gelled to perfection, leaned back in his chair and snapped his fingers at her. "Hey you," he said, his voice carrying a bored arrogance. "This wine's terrible. You must have picked the cheapest one, huh?" He held up his glass, swirling it like he was in a commercial, and grinned at his date, who giggled on cue. Elena approached her tray balanced and said, "I can bring you another, sir." Her tone was even professional, but the man waved her off. "Nah, forget it. Just don't expect a tip from me." His date laughed louder, and a few nearby tables joined in their eyes, flicking to Elena's stained apron. She nodded, her lips pressed together, and walked away, her steps deliberate. The Italian guest, still watching, set his fork down, his face hardening as he stared at the man in the blazer. Later, as Elena refilled water glasses at a quiet table, a teenage girl in a designer dress, her phone propped up for a selfie, glanced at her and snickered. "Hey, you missed a spot," she said, pointing at a non-existent mark on the table. Her friends, all glued to their phones, laughed without looking up. The girl flicked her hair and leaned forward, her voice loud enough to draw eyes. "Seriously, how do you even get a job here looking like that?" Elena paused, her pitcher steady in her hand, and wiped the table with a cloth, her movements deliberate. "All clean now," she said, her voice soft but clear, her eyes meeting the girl's for a split second. The girl's smirk froze her friend's laughter, trailing off as Elena walked away, her posture unbroken. The Italian guest, still watching, nodded slightly, his fingers tapping his glass like he was keeping score. Adrian Moretti didn't move. He sat back, his phone in hand, and made a call. His voice was too low to hear, but his eyes stayed on Elena, sharp and focused. 5 minutes later, the restaurant doors swung open. 2 men in black suits walked in, their faces hard, their steps synchronized. Bodyguards. The room went still, the clatter of forks and glasses stopping like someone had hit a mute button. The men walked straight to Elena, who was clearing a table, and one of them bowed slightly. "Miss Rossi," he said, his voice formal but warm. "This way, please." Outside, through the glass doors, a Rolls-Royce Phantom gleamed under the streetlights, the Moretti Air logo etched into its side. The VIPs at the table went pale. Kristen's smirk vanished, her hands shaking as she tried to pour a drink. The Italian guest smiled to himself, raising his glass in a silent toast. The restaurant manager, Diane, a woman with a pinched face and a scowl that seemed permanent, pushed through the crowd. Her heels clicked like gunfire as she stormed toward Elena. "What is this?" She snapped, her voice loud enough to make heads turn. "You've disrupted the entire restaurant." She grabbed Elena's apron, yanking it off her and throwing it onto a nearby chair. "You're fired," she said, her words sharp and final. Right here, right now. The waitstaff smirked Derek, crossing his arms with a grin. Tried to rise too high, he muttered to Kristen. Ended up unemployed. Elena stood there, her hands empty, her eyes fixed on the crumpled apron. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she brushed it away quickly, her jaw tightening. The room felt colder, the air heavy with the weight of every stare. As Diane turned away, a man in a pinstripe suit, his cufflinks gleaming, stood up from a nearby table. He was a regular, the kind who tipped big but expected the world in return. "This is a disgrace," he said, his voice booming, pointing at Elena. "She's making a scene embarrassing us all." He gestured to the room as if rallying support. "Get her out of here before she ruins the evening." A few guests nodded, their faces tight with agreement. Elena's hands clenched at her sides, but she didn't move. She looked at the man, her eyes steady, and said, "I'm sorry you feel that way." Her voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made the man pause, his hand dropping slightly. The room watched the tension thick as Elena turned back to her tray, her movements slow but unbroken. Just then, an older woman at a corner table, her silver hair pinned elegantly, stood up and walked toward Elena. She carried a small leather notebook, her hands steady despite her age. "Young lady," she said, her voice clear and commanding, "I heard you speak earlier." That was no act. She opened the notebook, revealing a page of handwritten Italian phrases, and handed it to Elena. "I wrote these down from my last trip to Florence. Can you read them?" Elena took the notebook, her fingers brushing the worn leather, and read the lines aloud, her voice soft but flawless. The woman smiled, her eyes bright. "You're a gift," she said, loud enough for the room to hear. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The room stirred, a few guests clapping softly, their faces softening. Elena handed the notebook back, her lips trembling slightly, and nodded in thanks. Adrian stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, like a man who knew the power of every step. He walked over, picked up the apron, and handed it back to Elena. His eyes locked onto Diane's, and the manager took a step back, her scowl faltering. "Your biggest mistake tonight," he said, his voice low, but carrying was firing the most valuable person in this restaurant. He turned to Elena, his expression softening again. "I need an Italian interpreter here in New York," he said. "Do you want the job?" He reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim envelope, sliding it into her hand. Inside was a first-class ticket to Rome, the paper crisp and heavy. Tucked beside it was a handwritten note, the ink still fresh. "Italy is waiting for you." Elena's fingers closed around the envelope, her breath catching. The VIP who'd spilled the wine shot up from his seat, his face red with anger. "A waitress as an international interpreter?" he said, his voice booming. "That's ridiculous." His friends laughed, but it was nervous now, less certain. "I'll buy this restaurant," he said, pointing at Elena, "just to ban her forever." The room crackled with tension, every eye on Elena. She clutched the ticket tighter, her knuckles white, her eyes brimming but not breaking. The Italian guest set down his glass, his smile gone. The woman with the pearls stopped recording, her hand shaking slightly. Everyone waited, the air thick with anticipation. Before Adrian could respond, a waiter from the back, a quiet guy named Marco, who rarely spoke, stepped forward. He'd been watching all night, his eyes darting between Elena and the others. He held up a small notebook, his hands trembling slightly. "I heard her," he said, his voice cracking but loud. "She's been helping me with Italian for weeks. She's the real deal." The room turned to him, surprised, as he flipped open the notebook, showing pages of phrases Elena had written for him. The VIP's face twitched, his bravado slipping. Elena looked at Marco, her eyes softening for a moment, and she nodded just once. The gesture was small, but it felt like a bridge, a quiet thank you that carried more weight than words. As the tension hung in the air, a young busboy barely out of high school dropped a stack of plates near the kitchen door. The crash echoed, drawing every eye. He scrambled to pick them up, his face red, but Elena was there in an instant, kneeling beside him. She gathered the broken pieces without a word, her hands steady, her movements calm. "It's okay," she said softly, helping him stack the shards. The busboy looked at her, his eyes wide with gratitude, and whispered, "Thanks, Elena." The room watched the moment, small but heavy, as if her kindness was a rebuke to the cruelty around her. A few guests lowered their eyes, their forks still. The VIP in the blazer shifted uncomfortably, his glass untouched. Adrian didn't flinch. He reached into his jacket again and pulled out a slim, dark red passport. Italian, diplomatic. He held it up, the gold crest catching the light. "This woman," he said, his voice calm but final, "will sit next to me on tonight's flight to Rome." Whoever dares stop her dares oppose me. The room went dead silent. The VIP's face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. He stumbled back his chair, scraping against the floor. A few American guests started clapping their hands loud in the quiet. Others looked down, their faces flushed with shame. Elena looked at the ticket in her hand, her lips trembling into a small, quiet smile. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The next morning, the restaurant was a different place. Diane, the manager, was gone. A curt email from corporate cited unprofessional conduct, and her office was cleared out by noon. Kristen, the blonde waitress who'd torn up the card, woke up to her name trending online, not in a good way. The woman with the pearls had posted her video, and it spread like wildfire, the comments tearing into Kristen's cruelty. By the end of the week, she'd been let go, her name blacklisted at every high-end spot in the city. Derek, the smirking waiter, lost his sponsorship with a local wine brand after they saw the same video. The VIP who'd spilled the wine. His hedge fund dropped him as a partner, the news buried in a press release about restructuring. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone knew why. The truth had a way of catching up. Elena didn't see any of it. She was already gone. That night she'd walked out of the restaurant, the ticket and note still in her hand, her apron folded neatly over her arm. She didn't look back, didn't pause to gloat. Her steps were steady, her head high, just like her parents had taught her. The Rolls-Royce was waiting, the driver holding the door open. Adrian was already inside, his face calm but warm. "Ready?" he asked, his voice soft. Elena nodded, sliding into the seat beside him. The car pulled away, the city lights blurring past the windows. She looked down at the note again, her fingers tracing the words, "Italy is waiting for you." For the first time that night, her smile reached her eyes. Years ago, she'd sat in her family's small apartment, listening to her father's stories about Italy. His hands moved as he spoke, painting pictures of cobblestone streets and sunlit vineyards. She had taught herself Italian from old books and tapes, practicing late into the night, her voice echoing in the quiet. Her parents were wealthy now, their company a quiet giant in the tech world, but they had never let her forget where they came from. "You don't need to prove yourself," her mother used to say, brushing Elena's hair back. "Just be yourself." That night in the restaurant, she'd done just that, and it had been enough. As the car rolled through the city, Elena's gaze drifted to a street vendor selling flowers, their colors bright against the gray pavement. It reminded her of a market her mother used to take her to, where they'd pick out roses and talk about dreams. She'd always wanted to see Italy, to walk the streets her parents described, to feel the history in the air. Her fingers brushed the ticket in her hand, and for a moment her breath caught, not from fear, but from something bigger, a possibility she'd never let herself imagine. She glanced at Adrian, who was looking out his own window, his face calm but thoughtful. She didn't say anything, but her shoulders relaxed just a little as the car moved toward the airport. The plane to Rome was quiet, the hum of the engines a soft backdrop. Elena sat by the window, the ticket still in her hand, the note tucked into her pocket. Adrian didn't say much, just worked on his laptop, his presence steady beside her. She looked out at the clouds, the world below fading into a blur. She thought of her parents, of the stories they'd told her, of the way they taught her to stand tall. She thought of the restaurant, of the laughter, of the wine stain on her apron. And she thought of the future waiting just beyond the horizon. Life doesn't always give you justice. Sometimes it gives you pain, judgment, cruelty. But sometimes it gives you a moment, a chance to be seen, to be known, to be enough. Elena found that moment. She carried it with her like a light in the dark. And you watching this, you carry it too. You've felt the weight of unfair eyes, the sting of words meant to cut. But you're still here. You're still standing. You're not alone. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.